Welcome to the Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture with leading experts on the Bible, hosted by Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe on our website at thetwotestaments.com, where you can find our library of episodes and donate to support our work. Follow us also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Welcome to the Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture. I'm Ronnie Cosman.
And I'm Will Kynes.
And in this episode, we're taking off. We're starting our journey through the Minor Prophets, or as they're otherwise known, the Book of the 12. And we're joined today by Dr. James Nogalski.
So James Nogalski is W. Marshall and Lulie Craig Professor of Old Testament at Baylor University. And his publications on biblical prophecy and the Book of the 12 in particular are prolific. And so they include in chronological order. And I think the chronological order here is significant because in some ways, Jim's career reflects the development of discussion around the Book of the 12, some of the things that we're going to be talking about now. So his first two books, Literary Precursors to the Book of the 12 and Redactional Processes in the Book of the 12, both published by Gruyter. Now, Jim, were those two books the result of your PhD dissertation?
Yes, 600 pages. When Walter Kaiser accepted it, he allowed me to do it as a camera-ready copy, but had to rearrange the chapters. In the dissertation, I did them canonically, but he wanted them in the order that they were processed, were the early collections and then the later.
Okay, so most PhD students are fortunate to get one book out of their PhD dissertation. Jim got two, which is very impressive. And then we go on to, now you may have had some other books in between here, but it's interesting that in 2009 you published with Ehud Ben-Zvi Two Sides of a Coin, Juxtaposing Views on Interpreting the Book of the 12/12 Prophetic Books. Could you tell us briefly, what were the two sides of the coin there? Where did you fall and where did Ehud Ben-Zvi fall?
Well, Ehud and I have had about a 25 or 30-year ongoing conversation about whether the Book of the 12 means anything or not. And he maintains that the 12 prophets are individual collections and should be treated as such. I have maintained that they are individual collections that have been arranged and in some cases edited to be heard alongside the other 11.
Yeah, and so this is one of the reasons why I really wanted to bring you in as we start this journey through the Book of the 12, because, on the Two Testaments, we're now entering our third season, and our general approach is to do one Old Testament book and one New Testament book each season. And some listeners may ask, well, you're not really doing one Old Testament book, you're doing 12 this season. Well, yes and no, right? We are in some ways, and I think Jim will help us think this through. Yes, there are 12 different books, but in some ways they also significantly contribute to one collection, which is important to keep in mind. But let's keep on moving through Jim's publications. We're not even halfway done yet. So after that edited volume, you have another 2-volume commentary. So this is a commentary on the Book of the 12, published by Smith and Helwis. And so you've divided into Hosea to Jonah and then Micah to Malachi. So now I don't know if I've encountered, yes, you have collections of commentaries on the 12 prophets, but is your commentary distinct in that it's a commentary on the Book of the 12 and drawing out connections in between the texts?
It is distinct, but not quite unique.
Okay.
Marvin Sweeney did his in 2000, and he called it the 12 prophets, and he did give some attention to the shape of the collection as a whole, but not to the extent that it affected his exegetical work all that much.
Okay. So if you're interested in the kind of things we're going to be talking about in this episode, and then it does come up as we go through the episodes in the future, this might be a good commentary to look at because you're getting introduction to each of the 12 books, but also some allusions to the significance interpretively of attending to connections between them. And then we've got 3 more here on prophetic literature that you've published. So interpreting prophetic literature, historical and exegetical tools for reading the prophets. So this is our first prophetic book that we're looking at in the podcast. And so if you're thinking about, well, how do I do this well? How do I read the text well? This might be a good one for you to look at. And then you had a series of collected essays. And this is when you know you've really made it as a scholar, when you get your collected essays published. So that was the Book of the 12 and Beyond. And then the last one that I have, and there may be something published since, but the last thing that I have is an introduction to the Hebrew prophets, and that's published with Abingdon. It's funny how, and this often happens with scholars, you get to the end of your career, and that's when you write the introduction to whatever it is that you're an expert in. So anything since then that I don't have?
Well, the Nikot volume of Joel, Obadiah, and Jonah came out in March.
Okay.
And the Micah volume for that series is in the press. It'll be out next March.
Okay. So what we have here is a true expert on the Book of the 12, an appropriate person to help get us started on this journey through these 12 books. And so the first question that we have for you, Jim, is what should we call this collection of books? So some people will probably be more familiar with them as the Minor Prophets, but we've already talked now about the Book of the 12. So in your scholarship, you often refer to them, even in the titles of these books, as the Book of the 12. Why do you do that? What's the significance of these 2 titles in terms of the way we think about these texts?
Well, this goes back to a comment that was made by one of my professors when I was in seminary, taking a January term course on Malachi. And he was rolling along talking about this Hebrew participle at one point, and then he just stopped, as he was prone to do, and he something off the cuff, and he said, there's this ancient tradition that these 12 books were written on a single scroll and counted as a single book, and I've often wondered if there's anything to that. And now back to this participle, and he just went on. And that line stuck with me. And interestingly, Paul House, who's at Divinity School at Stanford, was in that same class. And he wrote a book called The Unity of the 12. We did not know each other were working on that, but it stuck with both of us. So when it came time, I did a THM at an international seminary, International Baptist Seminary in Ruschlakan, Switzerland, just outside Zurich. And my first semester there, my Old Testament professor asked, so have you given any thought to a THM thesis? And of course, the honest answer would have been no, but you don't want to say that in front of your soon-to-be advisor. And so what came out was my parroting J.J. Owen's statement. Well, there's this ancient Jewish tradition that these books were written on a single scroll and counted as a single book, and I'd like to know if there's anything to that. He goes, interesting. How will you do that? I said, I have no idea. And so we agreed I would start by reading them. And over that summer I began, and that's when I noticed these catchword connections, or the catchword phenomenon, as I later labeled it, where the beginning of one book contained words that, or the end of one book contained words that reappeared in the beginning of the next book. And I spent my career trying to track down the implications of that.
So when people refer to them as the Minor Prophets, how do you react to that? I mean, do you want to grab them by the shoulders and say, no, there's so much more there that you're missing? What do we miss when we think about it that way?
And what do people mean when they call them the Minor Prophets?
Well, this is one of those things that does kind of stick in my craw, that I politely correct them most of the time, politely at least, and say around here we call it the 12, or the Book of the 12. It goes back to Augustine, who referred to them as the Minor Prophets because of their size. And there were the major theory prior to the 1970s was that these were books that were written, and some people said arranged, because they were small enough to fit into a single scroll, and that they were arranged by size. So Hosea being the longest, then so on and so forth. Well, you don't have to look very far to realize that doesn't work. Hosea has 14 chapters, but so does Zechariah. Amos has 9 chapters, but Joel, in between those two, only has 4. And Obadiah, that comes after Amos, has only 21 verses, 1 chapter of 21 verses. So that doesn't work.
Yeah.
So
if they're ordering them based on length, they're doing a terrible job of it.
Exactly. And so I was working with the hope, and eventually did that, entering PhD work at the University of Zurich, working with Odile Hannes Steck, who was very much into the question of how do you read the book of Isaiah? We talk about 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah because of the 8th century, the exilic and the post-exilic settings of chapters in those books. But he maintained that there's something you're missing if you're not looking at the whole scroll. And so that was kind of the approach I modified with the 12, given the fact that it is 12 prophetic personas that are mentioned in the superscriptions. And but it was a good combination, because he was asking many of the same questions, and how were editors arranging these books and putting them together so that they expected you to remember something you'd read in chapter 11 when you got to chapter 65, or
So potentially similar redactional strategies, and we're going to come back to redactional questions in a little bit here, but the similar kind of idea of, hey, maybe there's a way that these are being pulled together in order to draw significance. And as readers, we should be paying attention to those kinds of connections.
yes.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that this is an ancient tradition that they were written on one scroll. Do we have evidence that they were in fact placed on the same scroll?
Yes, when the earliest one comes from about 200 BC or BCE, is in chapter 49 of Sirach, and where it's part of the Hymn of the Fathers, where the hymn recounts some of the events of some of the heroes of the faith, and then puts them into context with the kings who were ruling at that time. And so there's a chronological development. And when it gets to the point where it comes to the 8th century, it mentions Hezekiah and then Isaiah, and it quotes a verse out of Isaiah 40, because he comforted my people. So it gives a kind of thematic summary of the book. And then it does the same thing for Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 prophets, or the 12. And because they provided Jacob with confident hope, and then it quotes a theme out of, or picks up an strong allusion to Haggai in so doing that. And then by the time you get to Josephus and 4th Ezra in the 1st century CE, both of them are starting to recount the number of books that are in the Hebrew Bible. One of them lists 24, one of them lists 22, but you can't get there unless you count the 12 as one book. And then it goes on into some of the early church fathers, most notably Jerome, who begins his commentary on Hosea with what to me is a famous statement, at least, that the 12 prophets are one book, making it pretty clear. And that means that you have the Torah, which is 5 books. You have the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which are 4 books. And then you have 4 books of the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. And so that's around 400 CE, and there are things scattered through there. The Masoretic text that we have from the Leningrad Codex in 1000 CE counts the number of verses in the books, but with the 12, it also counts the number of verses in the entire scroll of the 12. And it marks at Micah 3:12. It makes a note, this is the halfway point of the scroll. And there are 1,025 verses before that and 1,025 verses after that. So they were pretty good at counting.
Yeah. Just to read that verse from Sirach. So this is Sirach 49, verse 10. And it's following, as Jim mentioned, it's following a mention of David and Hezekiah and Josiah. And then it talks about Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, interestingly, Job in verse 9, and then verse 10, may the bones of the 12 prophets send forth new life from where they lie, for they comforted the people of Jacob and delivered them with confident hope. So there you get that example of treating the 12 as one thing, one entity.
And if you read the next verse, you'll see.
Okay, verse 11. How shall we magnify Zerubbabel? He was like a signet ring on the right hand.
Which quotes Haggai 2:20-23.
There you go. Okay.
Great. What for you is the most difficult thing to understand about the Book of the 12?
Well, I've ceased referring to it as difficult, but fascinating is that it still maintains my interest after all these years. I guess it's helping people to understand that just because it's a collection, it's some people would call it an anthology, it does have a pretty standard order. There are actually 2, one in the Septuagint and one in the Masoretic text that the English Bible follows. And that arrangement has both a chronological structure and some recurring themes that are highlighted through these catchwords that appear at the beginning and end of the books, as well as through the content of the books themselves. And I've come to see it as a kind of, the whole prophetic corpus is a kind of curriculum for scribes and interpreters of Scripture that were taught not at a basic level, but at an advanced level, but were designed to be read with the history of Israel and Judah in mind. There is about 15 years ago, I was doing a Bible study for Nehemiah, which was the Southern Baptist January Bible study that year. And I came across this verse in Ezra's prayer in Nehemiah 9. And if you know that passage, he's praying and he rehearses the whole history of Israel and why they were punished. And unlike our modern explanations, we tend to see the end of the punishment as the return from exile. And that at that point, things began to look up and to work out differently. But this is a book, so that would have been in the last third of the 6th century BC. But Ezra would have been from a century later, in the 5th century. And he mentions his prayer, and then in 932 he says, how long, O Lord, will we have to suffer? Because we have been suffering from the times of the kings of Assyria until today. And that struck me that's exactly the framework chronologically of both Isaiah and the 12. Both of them start in the 8th century. Both of them go well into the Persian period. Incidentally, both of them skip the destruction and the exile. Zephaniah is the last pre-exilic book in the 12, who's dated in the time of Josiah. And the next book is Haggai, and they're conversing about rebuilding the temple in 520. So you've got almost 100-year, 90 or 100-year gap. In Isaiah, it's even longer. That you go from chapter 39, which is about the siege of Sennacherib, and then chapter 40, comfort ye, my people, it's about the return from Babylon. And so they don't deal with the exile at all. It's about the judgment is coming. Now what do we do now that it's over? Or now that we're coming back? But then Jeremiah and Ezekiel deal with the lead up and the aftermath of the destruction. Jeremiah from inside the land, Ezekiel from outside the land. So I think there was a lot of deliberations that went into how these books were formed, and they are structured around the events of 587 and the theological implications of that.
That's a great segue into the next area we'd like to explore with you, which is the historical context of these books within the Book of the 12. Now, obviously, we're not going to have you walk through every book in the Book of the 12 and talk about when it was dated and so forth, but you've already touched on the general historical context of these books. So where does it extend from and where does it extend to in terms of the composition of the books? And then I'd like to hear about the redaction of the collection as a whole and the historical context of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, so by most scholarly datings, Amos was the earliest, mid-8th century, so 850, 840, somewhere in there, followed by Hosea, followed by Micah. But if chronology was the key, or the only key, then Amos would have come first. But that's not the case. But thematically, you have another structural issue in the thematic development. I refer to 4 books as what I originally called the Deuteronomistic corpus because of their relationship to some key Deuteronomistic ideas. But then, so that was Hosea, Amos, Micah, and Zephaniah. And what I realized fairly early on was that these 4 books had 2 thematic structures. That Hosea alternates between judgment and salvation. So chapters 1 to 3 each begin with judgment and end with a note of salvation. Then chapters 4 to 10, judgment. But chapter 11, how can I do this to Jacob? And it's a message of deliverance. Same with 12 to 14. 12 and 13 are all about judgment. And chapter 14 is about repentance of the people and Yahweh's promise to deliver them. So it leaves you constantly confronting this idea of God's judgment and God's mercy. In Amos, which would have been the next book in this early collection, there's none of that. The decision has been made that Israel, the northern kingdom, will be destroyed, and Judah will be punished as well because of her tendency to follow Israel. And so from the outset, for 8.5 chapters, it is all judgment in Amos. Only in the last 5 verses do you get this promise that returns for a new kingdom with a new David who will come in, and Yahweh will restore the fertility of the land. Then you move to Micah, and Hosea and Amos focus on Israel, the northern kingdom. Micah changes to focus on Judah and Jerusalem. But the very first passage of Micah condemns them for following the path of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom. And then it goes on to alternate judgment and salvation, just like Hosea does, and to look forward into the distant future when there will be punishment and deliverance. But when Zephaniah begins, it also focuses on Judah and Jerusalem. But like Amos, the decision for judgment has already begun and has already been made. And there are strong allusions in the opening passage to what DeRoche calls the undoing of creation. It talks in verses 1, 2, and 3, chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, the judgment is announced in the exact backwards order of creation. And so it's thus the undoing of creation. And it also, though, ends with promise of restoration. And then, so that kind of structures the theological elements in this book. And then Haggai and Zechariah, 1 to 8, focus on rebuilding the temple after the exile. Malachi, and here's where Paul House and I differ in our presentations. He sees Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi as the final upturn to the salvific intention of Yahweh. I read Malachi a little more, not cynically, but a little more attuned to the confrontation that it is, in essence, a return to Hosea, that the people in Malachi are once again worshiping incorrectly. They're once again ignoring Yahweh's demands. And so it's not so much a continuation of the salvation, but a real warning that that judgment will continue if you continue down this path. And then the other books work with the theme of the day of Yahweh, the day of the Lord. Joel, Obadiah, Nahum, Habakkuk. Nahum and Habakkuk do this with the Assyrian and Babylonian nations who come in and take over. Joel and Obadiah does this with Edom, in a direct contrast with the fate of the northern kingdom that ends the book of Amos. It has very similar things, but with Edom. So the Jacob-Esau tradition is being played off there. Joel is sort of the overarching thematic book. I've referred to it as the literary anchor to the 12, that almost every recurring theme in the book of the 12 takes place in significant ways in those 4 chapters of Joel. So that's kind of...
Yeah. So when we think about the historical context of that development, so you've got these texts being written at different periods in Israel's history. And you mentioned, going back to the 8th century and then all the way forward. When would you date the original composition of the latest text within the 12?
Well, there's debates about that, which is the latest text. I think the latest book to enter was Jonah in most of the redactional models. There is one outlier in terms of the order. There is one manuscript at Qumran, which Russell Fuller, in his work on the Qumran materials of the 12, argues that Jonah actually appears in one manuscript after Malachi. That has been challenged by a number of scholars that think he sees the physical seams of the scrolls a bit too loosely, but most see Jonah as a late Persian, early Hellenistic writing, and so it would have been the last. But I also think Zechariah 9 to 14 is a very late block in this development. Some people, there's been a move to kind of push it into the mid-5th century. Mark Boda's recent Nikot commentary is an example of that. And that's in reaction to the early 20th century, late 19th century, which put that into the Hellenistic period. I myself am still convinced more by the arguments of the Hellenistic milieu for those chapters that kind of bring many of the themes of the 12 back into play one more time before Malachi.
Right.
But regardless, it's fairly late in the process.
So depending on the dating, you may have, around 500 years of these books being written. But then there's also the historical process of these separate books being brought together into this one thing. So how is that process developing? Do we have earlier collections that are then added to over time? How does that work?
Well, that's where in my first 2 volumes that you mentioned, that's the literary precursors that I argue that 4 of the books are taking prophetic genres and reading the historical narrative, reading them with the historical narrative, and particularly emphasizing things that come out in 2 Kings 17, where Yahweh announces the destruction of the northern kingdom because of their continued worship of Baal and other deities and their refusal to recognize Jerusalem as the place where Yahweh's temple would be and so forth. And I think that those 4 books, Hosea, Amos, Micah, and Zephaniah, make sense coming together in the aftermath of the putting together of the Deuteronomistic history in the mid-6th century. So I think that was one collection, that group of 4. And then Haggai and Zechariah 1-8, there's a long history of scholarship that has seen those as a redacted whole, that they were originally the works of separate prophetic figures, but were combined and edited together with dates that move essentially chronologically, though the first oracle from in the book of Zechariah overlaps with the last oracles of Haggai.
So those thematic and historical connections may also be reflections of redactional collections within the book of the 12. Right. Okay. So you're seeing those, all of that evidence is kind of fishtailing together, dovetailing together to make a case for this progression over time. And we don't know exactly when the 12 is considered one thing, but already we have in Sirach this evidence that it's being thought that.
And that date is fairly widely recognized as between 200 and 180 BC.
Yeah. Right.
And the prologue from his grandson being widely seen as around 180.
Yep.
Now you've mentioned how there may be this one manuscript from Qumran where Jonah comes after Malachi. So now we're going to maybe shift gears to talk a little bit about the ordering of the books. Are they pretty much ordered the same way in different Jewish, Christian, Hebrew, and Greek traditions? The individual books themselves, and then when we talk about the Book of the 12 as a collection, in terms of where it appears in the different kind of, traditions of arranging the books of the Bible, how do they differ? How are they similar? What's significant about that in terms of how they're arranged?
Well, there are 2 primary, as I mentioned, 2 primary sequences, leaving aside the one from Qumran that's, I think, really debated now.
Sure.
But they are what we have in our English Bible that follows the Hebrew order, and then the Septuagint order, which instead of Hosea, Joel, where the first five of the first 6 are slightly differently arranged. So instead of Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, and Micah, it's Hosea, Amos, Micah, Joel, Obadiah, Jonah, and then Nahum through Malachi is the same in both. And so how one explains that, which one comes first, I have good friends who have argued that the Septuagint was the original order. I find that not very compelling because it's much more logical order in that it begins with the 3 8th century prophets right together. And why would you move that if you were editing it for something else? So, and then there's a British scholar, her name is Danes. She has investigated the catchword connections, and she has argued that they are much more strongly present in the Masoretic order than in the Septuagint order. So then the question is, well, what happened? Well, the Septuagint order has a tendency to put things in their chronological place. So the book of Judges is followed by Ruth because in the Hebrew order, Ruth is part of the writings, but they put it following Judges because Ruth begins in the time when the judges judged. And there are other examples of that where the arrangement of books from the writings were moved into a more historically oriented order. So when you look at that and you realize that all someone did was move Amos and Micah to the front with Hosea, that had the 3 8th century prophets and had the same kings mentioned in the superscriptions. And then Joel, Obadiah, and Jonah are still in the same order. And so it was a very easy move just to copy those 3 together. And so and then the question gets more complicated when you go into later interpretations. When you're talking about the order of books that are scrolls, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Whether Ruth came after Judges or not, Ruth is part of the Megillot and Judges part of the Deuteronomistic history. But once you get codexes, then the order becomes more fixed. And one of the things that the Septuagint order landed on, and there is a debate on how much this was influenced by Christian scholars versus Jewish scholars, is that the prophets came at the end of the First Testament. That's why Malachi is the end of the Old Testament in the Christian Bible, and it's followed immediately then, in most cases, by Matthew. And so it's prophecy that leads to the gospel, not counting the study Bibles that put the Apocrypha in between sometimes. But those writings were woven into earlier parts of the Hebrew Bible by the Septuagint. So there may have been some theological reflection on the role of prophets in predicting the coming of Jesus, even at least in terms of how that was resonated, if not in terms of how it actually developed.
Right, because the Septuagint order probably is pre-Christian. Is that right? I mean, the codices are developing around the same time, so...
Yes, I think in most cases it is, but the question of how much that was part of the synagogue tradition versus Christian retrieval of that tradition, that's where it gets a little hazy, and we have no real documentation for any of that, so that leaves it wide open to speculation.
Sure. Bringing up the example of Judges and Ruth is actually helpfully illuminating as an analogy for some of the processes that you're talking about in the 12, because in the Septuagint order, what you have is, as you mentioned, Jim, you have this historical instinct, right? So Ruth happened during the time of the Judges, so let's put Ruth after Judges. But one of the things that scholars think leads to Ruth being put after Proverbs in the Hebrew ordering, the Masoretic ordering, is because of this catchword between Proverbs 31 and Ruth. So the last chapter of Proverbs is a description of the virtuous woman, the capable wife, however we translate that, the Eshet Chayil.
Woman of strength or whatever, yeah.
The only other place where that phrase is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible is in Ruth. And so you've got this connection, and becomes a thematic connection between them as well. So you also see some of that going on in the prophets, right? Where the Septuagint's instinct is to put things in historical order, but as a result, you miss some of these catchwords. And this is one of the things that Jim's work brings out really helpfully. Could you walk us through a few other examples like that, where intertextual connections between the texts help us see things we might not otherwise notice?
Yeah, so I mentioned Amos and Obadiah. That's a good example. There is in that is the fifth vision, chapter 9 of Amos begins with the fifth vision of Amos, fifth and final. And it talks about the futility of trying to escape God's judgment. And says things like, though you go to the heights of heavens, from there I will pull you down. That phrase, from there I will pull you down, appears in only two other places. One of them is in Obadiah, the very next book, in Obadiah 3, from there I will pull you down. And it's part of a litany of judgment passages against Obadiah. The other place where that phrase appears is in Jeremiah 49, 14 through 16, which is almost an exact parallel to Obadiah 2 through 5. So it's the same text about Edom. And so why this emphasis on Edom? There was this sense of betrayal, that this is the Jacob-Esau tradition. These are brothers who should have tended to the needs of one another. But there are these pockets of tradition that accuse Edom of helping the Babylonians in the destruction of Jerusalem, or in the aftermath of the destruction of Jerusalem. And Edom was taking territory from Judah in the aftermath of the Babylonian invasion. They went from being located beyond the river to being located in southern Judah, to the point where by the time of Jesus, Idumea, the descendants of Edom, is directly south of Jerusalem. And so there has the population migrated into that area. And it struck me that you have the fifth vision is about the destruction of the temple in the northern kingdom of Amos, and then you follow with this denunciation of Edom, which has a lot of, not just that, but a very strong resonance of those catchwords that keep reappearing. And the thematic structure is also the same number of instances of Bayom Hahu, on that day, which is an eschatological formula in prophetic literature. And the same thematic hope for a renewed Davidic kingdom. And so it strikes me that that's when you have the destruction of the northern kingdom followed by the destruction of Edom, which is the other brother kingdom. So you have Jacob, which is in some texts a name for the northern kingdom, some texts it's a name for the southern kingdom, but it does, the Jacob Isaac reference. You have the two brother kingdoms, their judgment announced side by side in the 12, and they mirror one another thematically and use a lot of the same language. And so that's one strong case. There is the end of Hosea. It's a much more subtle insertion of these catchwords, where you have this. The end of Hosea talks about the Jacob or talks about Israel and Yahweh's willingness to hear their repentance, and in doing so, it talks about Israel in third masculine singular, except for this one half verse in Hebrew 14:8, English 14:7, where it says they will again grow grain, wine, and oil. And there it uses plural verb. And so you have this little parenthetical note that changes the mode of reference. And that triad of the grain, wine, and oil is a recurring motif throughout the 12 that talks about the fertility of the land as either indicative of God's wrath or God's promise for blessing. And that triad it appears in the blessings and curses of Deuteronomy, but it is overwhelmingly appears together in the 12 more than any other book. And so it is this recurring theme of the fertility of the land.
Another one that I've heard mentioned and probably came across first in your work, actually, Jim, is the one in Joel 3:16 and then Amos 1 verse 2, which is the Lord roars from Zion. And one of the reasons why I think scholars often point to this one is because, as you mentioned, Joel doesn't seem to be in proper chronological order here. And so this could be another example of like what we were just mentioning with Ruth and Proverbs 31, where it's actually the catchphrase that's doing the work of putting this book where it is. Do you want to add anything to that?
Only to complicate that a little bit further.
Okay.
In my model, two books, Joel and Obadiah, I argue never existed in the form that we have them, except in this literary context. So Joel was compiled from pre-existing material to fit between Hosea and Amos. And so this picking up of this triad of blessing and curse at the beginning of Joel, at the end of Joel, you have that citation, Joel 4:16, citing Amos 1:2, but two verses later, Joel 4:18, cites Amos 9:14 or 13, which is almost the last verse of Amos. And so it creates this citation that envelops the whole book of Amos. But Joel is a Jerusalem book. Amos is a Northern Kingdom book in terms of who the message is directed to. So it's this kind of envelopment that you start down this rabbit hole, and sometimes you think you're going crazy, except it all hangs together in this mysterious way that really enriches, I think, the interpretation of these books.
So, Jim, it could be helpful for our listeners as we're about to step into the minor prophets as a whole, which are texts that I think a lot of readers of the Bible are less familiar with than others.
I agree.
If you could just give us a very brief, and let's do this as a challenge. Let's see if you can summarize each book of the minor prophets in one sentence. So kind of a speed round here. The the main message of each book, or however you'd like to summarize it in one sentence. So I'll give you the prophetic book, and then you'll give me the one sentence summary, and we'll go through them like that. Okay.
No, I got to say before we start that,
Yes.
we've talked about how they're called minor prophets because they are smaller in size, right?
Yep,
Typically,
yep.
not because they're less significant.
Yep.
Though realistically, in the imagination and minds of most,
That's true.
most readers, they are more minor in their significance and how they've been read and understood, right?
Yeah.
Or appreciated. So, Jim, this is your opportunity to, with one sentence, brand upon the hearts of our listeners why these are not minor in significance.
Yes. Okay. So the book of the 12, and I'm going to use the English order that we have here. So starting with Hosea. So Hosea in one sentence.
Yeah, Hosea confronts the people of Israel with the need to repent and change with an open-ended offer of salvation.
Great.
That it ends with a promise of a blessing. Joel largely does the same thing with Judah and Jerusalem, but it comes from this perspective of the land that is no longer fertile, but will be one day if the people repent. And it cites Exodus 34, 6 and 7 to do so. Amos, the chance for change has passed by Israel. Judgment is coming. It cannot be avoided. Hope lies in the future reconstitution of the Davidic monarchy. Obadiah, Edom will be judged for its betrayal of Judah and Jerusalem. Jonah, the classic anti-prophet. It is the thematic outlier in the 12 in that it challenges and expands the theology of Joel in particular, that questions whether God has the right, not the ability, but the right to offer salvation to the nations, specifically the hated Assyrians. Micah offers the same vacillation between judgment and salvation as we found in Hosea, but for the southern kingdom. And it begins by saying, you have fallen into the trap that Samaria begins. So it alludes back to the themes of Hosea. Nahum. Now Nahum and Habakkuk step into the political arena of the empires, the Assyrian and the Babylonians. Nahum announces the destruction of Nineveh as an enemy of Yahweh on the coming day of the Lord. Habakkuk begins by taking up Micah 7, where the people are suffering under the oppression of their own unethical behavior. And the prophet cries out, "How long, O Lord, must I wait for you to change this?" God says, "Don't worry, I'm sending the Babylonians," which does not please the prophet. But this coming day of the Lord that's brought about by the Babylonians is followed in chapter 2 with the confrontation of the prophet to Yahweh, and the prophets in chapter 3, prophets coming around to understand what Yahweh is doing, and that taking comfort in, while we will be punished, so will the Babylonians, so will the enemy. Zephaniah announces the undoing of creation, the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah, and looks forward to a time of eschatological hope. I mentioned the one reference to the undoing of creation, but there's also two other references to Genesis 1 to 11. One is the reversal of the birth of the kingdoms in Genesis 10, and the other is the reversal through illusion of the Tower of Babel in Zephaniah 3:9. And All three of those come at redactionally significant places. Then Haggai skips forward. The people are back in the land. It's now time to rebuild the temple. Zechariah talks about how the temple will be organized to serve Yahweh and the people politically and religiously. Then expands into, in Zechariah 9-14, into the fate of Ephraim, the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem and Judah in 9-11 and 12-14. And the day of Yahweh is a major theme in these chapters. And then Malachi, we essentially circle back and restart the process. That the people are, once again, the temple is rebuilt and functioning, but they're bringing sacrifices that are inferior. They're not paying attention to the demands of Yahweh. The priests are castigated for their involvement, the people as well. But one group is singled out for their for the fact that they fear Yahweh. And that's in 3:16 and 17, when Yahweh announces that prophet announces that a book of remembrance was written before Yahweh for them, for the people, in order that they may discern between the righteous and the wicked. And I think that, in my mind, sums up the nature of the 12 as a scroll. That this is how you think about your fate in history and what has put you either at odds with God or aligning with God. And this one small group, this remnant, is singled out for their obedience. And so there's a sense of hope, but there's also a sense that the day of the Lord is coming. Who can endure his wrath?
That was impressive. I mean, if you've been publishing on the 12 for 30 years, this is what you can accomplish. You can walk people through. It was really great.
Great. Now, I got two questions that are related to each other. One of them, and maybe your answer is the same to both questions, but one of them is, which of the 12 is your favorite? Do you have a favorite one? And the second one, again, your answer may be different, but if you could only keep one of the 12 in the canon, which one would it be and why?
Well, I'd have to say my favorite is Jonah. It uses humor to upend the security of strongly held doctrinal beliefs and makes you uncomfortable certainly with understanding the prophet as the hero of the book. He does nothing right. When he finally does deliver his sermon, it's all of 5 words long, and it's the most dramatic conversion in the entire Bible. With an entire nation and its king and all its animals were fasted and changed. And I love teaching that to introductory Hebrew to get into the humor and the art of storytelling. If I were to only keep one book, I think it would probably be Micah. That alternation of judgment and deliverance, but that Micah 6:6-8 is just a great summary of the biblical ethic in terms of what does Yahweh expect from you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. I would ask that we could keep Hosea 11 with it, where Yahweh says, I am God and not man. I cannot judge, I cannot wipe them off the face of the earth, because Ephraim is the son that I raised, and I touched his cheek, and I held him on my knees. And this image of God the Father that is, I think, unparalleled in any other certainly Old Testament, but I think also New Testament text, with the pathos that it evokes.
Jim, let's talk a little bit about genre. These are the first prophetic books that we've handled on the Two Testaments podcast. What do you think our listeners need to know about how to read biblical prophecy and prophetic books well?
They are poetry, so you need to understand what that means. That's one of the reasons I put together that Interpreting Prophetic Literature book that from Westminster John Knox that you mentioned. Most people don't come, if they come with an understanding of poetry, it's rhyme or like the rap. But that's not the way Hebrew poetry works. It works with parallelism. It works with other kinds of structures. They also use the genres of the prophets: judgment oracles, woe oracles, trial speeches. Prophets were confrontational preachers. They did not suffer fools gladly, and spoke on behalf of Yahweh. The phrase "the word of Yahweh" appears overwhelmingly in the context where prophets appear. It only appears in the Torah in reference to Moses, the greatest prophet, and in Genesis 15, where Abram is portrayed as a prophet. So these are this idea of God communicating through a human messenger, through his spoken word, is very much part of the Hebrew idea of prophecy. But I think in terms of the collection as a whole, I do think some of the work of Carol Vandertoorn and David Carr has been at least very instrumental in my own thinking of this is the prophetic books were put together as curriculum to teach what it means to be obedient to God.
And so you should read them that way and look for what they're attempting to teach. Is that how that changes our interpretation?
Yes.
Right.
They're not predictive. They're didactic.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. Let's think about their place in the canon. We've talked a little bit about this, but I want to take a little different angle on the question of the prophets in the canon, which is, what do they contribute distinctively to the canon? If we didn't have the 12, what would we be missing out on? In fact, I think in the way that many churches, and I don't know about synagogues, but many churches in the way that they treat their canon, it is almost as if they don't have the 12, because very rarely do they engage with it. So what are you missing out on if you don't pay attention to these texts?
I think you're missing out on a serious reflection of what it means to live a life of faith in historical moments. To what extent are we our own worst enemies? To what extent are we ignoring God's expectations? Are we ignoring the land around us? Are we ignoring the things that create problems in the relationship between Yahweh and Yahweh's people, but also in and among people groups themselves? And I think that kind of theological reflection is very endemic to the prophets. Now, there is a cause and effect relationship that I think modern theology is less comfortable with than you have in the prophets. So Joel and Haggai blame the drought or the infestation of locusts on the actions of the people. I think we are in much the same way that after hurricanes, preachers are prone to say, this is God's judgment upon you. I remember when I was at Samford, we had these Baptist Student Union meetings, and I remember one night the testimonies that people would give. And one student talked about his experience with a tornado that was coming right toward him and his house, and I thought, oh no, we're going to get in one of these. I prayed and God delivered me from the tornado kinds of thing. And he said, and I prayed with all my might, God, take it away. And at that very instant, it veered away and killed the people next door. And I thought, that's what I'm talking about. You can't say that God sent the hurricane against New Orleans as judgment and not recognize the fact that if that's the case, he's a pretty poor aim because he missed the French Quarter. And he demolished the houses of the poor and needy. And that's not who God is. And so that's, I think, the gist of what I mean by wrestling with this. How is God involved in the life of believers and in the creation that is the world in which we live?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the Book of the 12 as you are, James, but tell me if you think this is a fair kind of thing to say, that when Jesus in Matthew 23, right, he chastises the scribes and the Pharisees for neglecting to do the weightier matters of the law. Is it fair to say that maybe what you find in the Book of the 12 is one of the things you find is a kind of crystallization of what are the weightier matters that when they are neglected, they really unravel kind of the relationship between Israel and God in certain ways and bring about God's wrath and ire and anger?
Yes, and yet God doesn't abandon them.
Yeah.
There is always hope that the remnant survives and that the relationship can be restored.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of suffering in between.
Yeah. Jim, if you could pick out a few major or persistent issues that maybe readers today, or maybe even readers throughout church history, through Jewish and Christian history, issues that they've grappled with in their interpretation of the Book of the 12, or that we grapple with today, what are those kinds of recurring, persistent things?
Well, some we were just talking about. What is the relationship of judgment and God's role in the events? Second, I think for Christian interpreters, there has been a strong tendency in our history to read, particularly the prophets, but the Hebrew Bible in general, as a Christological predictor of sorts that really does an injustice to the content of the biblical material. Those are the two, I think, in terms of corrections, the things that I would say, or the thing I would say would be most helpful to retain or recall is this idea that God doesn't give up, and that there is hope beyond the immediate crisis. But the crisis can get worse, but if you turn to God, it can get better.
Yeah, when I think about in our cultural mindset in America, where do the minor prophets or the Book of the 12, where do they play the strongest role? And the first thing I would think of is Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, his I Have a Dream speech, let justice roll down, right? Those are words from, that's Amos, right, Jim? So that, and it's exactly to the point that Jim's making, because that was a point of crisis in our nation. That was a point in which King was calling our nation to live according to a higher calling than it had lived according to.
And the Hebrew word mishpat, justice, has the same dual meaning as the English word justice. Justice is the right thing that we all should strive toward, but in the context of a legal context, justice is setting right what has gone wrong by punishing the perpetrator.
Right.
And so this mishpat has that same context, that these are the goal is to things have gotten off kilter and they need to be set right, and that is I think what King saw, and his the moral arc of history takes a long time, but it bends towards justice. Amos is that justice that rolls down like water is in the context of judgment more than deliverance. But that's where that Micah 6 passage, what does God expect from you, oh man? He's told you, do justice, love chesed, kindness, and walk humbly with your God.
Yeah. Well, that is a appropriate place for us to finish our conversation. So thank you, Jim. We just have one more question for you, which is one we like to ask all of our guests, which is for a blurb. Now, your books have received their fair share of blurbs, and I'm sure you've written your fair share of blurbs over the course of your career. But this doesn't have to be a blurb for a book. It could be a recommendation for anything that you have enjoyed and that you think our listeners might enjoy as well. So is there something that you could blurb for us?
Oh, yes. Last November, I was hospitalized for 2.5 weeks after serving as the Director of Graduate Studies for 12 years and having my administrative associate on parental leave, having 2 of our other departmental associates on leave, following an external review of our program that was months in the making. I worked myself nearly to death, and in early November, after I got out of the hospital, I resigned as graduate program director to return just to faculty status and to teach. And some of what I have done with that extra time is I've taken up reading novels again, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it. I love detective novels. And so I've read a lot of James Patterson. I have last week I finished a book by Robert Galbraith, which is the pen name for J.K. Rowling when she's not writing Harry Potter.
Okay.
And a 900-page book. And I just thoroughly find myself enmeshed in that. I still, on occasion, pick up my guitar and write and sing, so to take time to enjoy life and all that it has to offer.
Well, we'll have to have you on again so that you can play on your guitar and sing a song for us next time. If you were to recommend just one book, one novel that you've read recently, maybe one in the mystery genre that you enjoy so much, if listeners wanted to get into it, what would you recommend?
There's a trilogy by a Mississippi author named Isles, who writes about the 1960s in Mississippi. And his chief character is a African-American district attorney who is seeking justice both in the present and for the past. And those were gripping tales. I read one of them while I was in the hospital in a week. We're talking 1,100 pages. So it really captured my fancy, and then continued reading the other 2. But just find something that resonates with you and opens your mind up to where you're creating the world. You're not expecting a film to do it for you.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Well, Jim, thanks for taking the time to sort of walk us through and orient us to the landscape of the Book of the 12. And listeners, if you enjoyed this episode and you would like to pay us back justly and repay Jim back justly, this can be your act of justice, as you can go on wherever you listen to podcasts and give us that 5-star rating that will catapult us to podcast glory.
Well, or share it with someone else. I mean, I think the 5 minutes or so where Jim just walked us through all 12 books and gave us the summary of the major themes in all 12. That is worth its weight in gold. So share it to someone else, and that could help them. Because I think until you had done that, I hadn't ever really captured how all 12 books fit together in the message as it progresses across them. And so incredibly helpful. We are grateful for your time and lending your expertise to our podcast, Jim. Thank you so much.
My thanks to both of you.
This episode is co-sponsored by Samford University and the Alabama Humanities Alliance, a state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this episode do not necessarily represent those of the Alabama Humanities Alliance, the National Endowment for the Humanities, or Samford University. Thanks also to the Faculty Success Center and our student assistants for their help with production and promotion.